On July 4th, 1776, in the name of God, our forefathers declared themselves free from allegiance to Britain. Well, who exactly are these forefathers? Historians identify 10 figures as the key founding fathers. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and George Washington. Well, what about our foremothers? I take great pride in naming the names of these 10 patriots in our history, but in all fairness, you men get all the attention in this service, so I thought at least I could do a homily around the women. Well, while formal political leadership came from white, moderately wealthy, and educated male landowners who were often, but not always, slave owners, the revolution was won by ordinary citizens. But with great help from those assigned to the margins of colonial society, women in particular. We women participated by boycotting British goods. No more tea parties. Spying on the British. Following armies as they marched. Washing, cooking, and tending for the soldiers. The women were the messengers who would deliver secret messages around the terrain. And in a few cases, they actually disguised themselves as men and fought in the war. Now, in revolutionary days, war days, women were purposely shielded from the public eye and legally excluded from many aspects of business, politics, and religion. And despite their active participation in the revolution, women gained few new political or legal rights as a result. But although the revolution failed to bring significant changes to women's rights as citizens, there is evidence of subtle changes taking place in the women's status in the post-war years. Access to education for women slowly expanded, as did the number of female teachers. And then the 19th century would bring about a seismic shift of understanding of ideal womanhood. And this revolution, I found out, took place not in government buildings, but in the pages of novels. The new century saw a massive increase in the demand for books appealing to female readers. Books that promoted a new vision for women. And they started reading and reading and reading and wondering why things shouldn't change. Going back to the revolution, I wanted to introduce and acknowledge two courageous female writers who paved the way for this evolution of writing and thought. So I go to the summer of 1761. A ship named Phyllis arrived in Boston. A small girl, no more than 8 years old, stood shivering on the dock. They threw a bucket of water over her and her fellow shipmates, and she attempted to cover herself with an old piece of carpet. She was kidnapped from Africa and sold into slavery. Phyllis was named for the slave ship on which she was brought to America. She was probably captured on the west coast of Africa. Among the speculators at the Boston slave market that day was Susanna Wheatley, wife of John Wheatley, who was a wealthy Boston tailor. The mother of twins, Susanna was in search of help. And something about this poor, trembling, half-naked girl captured her attention. She took her in, taught her Latin, 19, Phyllis Wheatley wrote the poem On the Arrival of the Ships of War and Landing of the Troops. She appeared before George Washington, it was that time General George Washington, at a poetry reading in March 1776. She was a strong supporter of American independence, reflected in both the poems and the plays she wrote during the Revolutionary War. Many white colonists found it impossible to believe that an African slave was writing such excellent poetry. In Boston, they took her to court. Again, some things never change. They went to court, and she had to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this was her poetry. She had to defend her authorship. Her examiners concluded she had written the poems, but ironically, her first book of poetry was published in 1771 in London because publishing houses in Boston refused to publish any of her work. Phyllis Wheatley died from complications of childbirth at the age of 31. Despite her race, her class, and her gender, Phyllis Wheatley's legacy is of being one of America's Revolutionary War patriots, a symbol for abolitionists, and the foremother of African American literature. She is the first African American and the second woman to publish a book in the colonies at any point up to that time in history. She wrote, "In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. I will assert that same principle lives in us." The second figure I'd like to honor this morning is Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who was the second president of the United States. Abigail is remembered for the over 1,200 letters she wrote in her lifetime, most to her influential husband, who frequently sought her advice on matters of state. The letters serve as eyewitness accounts of the American Revolutionary War home front. She openly shared her opinion that slavery was evil and a threat to the American democratic experiment. Mrs. Adams was an advocate of more opportunities for women, particularly relevant to education and property rights. She wrote, "My pen is always freer than my tongue," which proved to be spot on when in March 1776 she penned a letter to John and the Continental Congress warning, "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a revolution, a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So it was from the fringe that powerful voices were heard that made a lasting impact on our society and also made a difference to me. As you can see, I'm standing here before you as clergy, which would never have happened so many years ago. But I would ask you this morning, 236 years later, who are the voices now assigned to the margins? African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, Hispanics, women, gay, lesbians, the disabled, children, senior citizens, people with limited English proficiency, the working poor, the homeless, members of particular religious groups, especially Muslims. These are groups that have been in the past or are currently facing being scapegoated and ostracized. We Christians have the most powerful example in history for our role model to change all of this. Jesus not only aspired to erase boundaries between the marginalized and the powerful, he came from and ministered to those on the fringes of society. And I would ask you as well, when do you feel like you're on the fringe of society? So remember, at some point, we all are pushed to the margins. And when we're there, we have to remember these examples of Abigail and Phyllis and the other people that have served this country so well and lifted their voices despite being on the margins. Never feel powerless. I will close with a letter written by Abigail Adams to her son, John Quincy Adams, who became our 6th president. The foundation of religion is the just sense of God's attributes, as in being infinitely wise, just, and good, to whom you owe the highest reverence, gratitude, and adoration, who governs all nature, even to clothing the lilies of the field, and hearing the young ravens when they cry, but more particularly regards the duties of mankind, which are comprised in one short sentence: thou shalt love thy neighbor